The Arizona Territory stretched endlessly under a crimson dawn, its vast expanse broken only by towering mesas and scattered sagebrush that swayed in the morning breeze. Samuel Harrison stood on the wooden porch of his ranch house, his weathered hands gripping a steaming cup of coffee as he watched the sun paint the desert landscape in shades of gold and amber. The year was 1873, and the frontier was still a place where survival depended on strength, determination, and sometimes unexpected mercy. Samuel had built his life carefully in this unforgiving land. His ranch, the vHe, sprawled across 2,000 acres of prime grazing territory, supporting nearly 500 head of cattle and a dozen of the finest horses in the territory. The main house, constructed from sturdy pine logs hauled down from the mountains, stood as a testament to his perseverance. Its wide porch wrapped around 3 sides, offering shade during the scorching summer months and protection from the winter winds that howled down from the peaks. Behind him, through the thick wooden door, he could hear the quiet sounds of his household awakening. His wife, Martha, had been gone for 2 years now, claimed by the consumption that had ravaged her lungs through the harsh winter of 1871. The memory of her final months still haunted him, the way she had fought so bravely against the disease, refusing to let it break her spirit, even as it slowly drained the life from her body. Their 3 children had struggled in the aftermath of her death. Thomas, now 14, had grown sullen and withdrawn, spending most of his time alone in the barn, avoiding the responsibilities that came with being the eldest son on a working ranch. Margaret, 12 years old, had taken on far too much responsibility for her age, trying desperately to fill the void left by their mother's absence. She cooked, cleaned, and attempted to maintain order in their disrupted household, but the weight of such duties was slowly crushing her young spirit. 8-year-old William, the youngest, had perhaps suffered the most. Once a vibrant, laughing child who followed his mother everywhere, he had barely spoken since her funeral. He spent his days sitting by her grave, a small headstone carved with her name that Samuel had placed beneath the old oak tree behind the house. The boy's silence had become so profound that Samuel sometimes wondered if his son would ever find his voice again. Samuel took another sip of his coffee and squinted toward the eastern horizon, where a dust cloud was rising in the distance. Living on the frontier meant being constantly alert for signs of trouble. Apache raids had been frequent in recent years, as the government's attempts to force the tribes onto reservations had led to increased tensions and violent conflicts. The local cavalry patrol made regular rounds, but their presence offered little comfort to isolated ranchers who knew that help could be hours or even days away when danger struck. As the dust cloud grew closer, Samuel could make out the familiar blue uniforms of soldiers. He set down his coffee cup and walked to the edge of the porch, his hand instinctively resting on the grip of the Colt revolver that never left his hip. The approaching riders numbered about a dozen, led by a figure Samuel recognized as Captain Bradley Morrison, the commanding officer of Fort Apache. Captain Morrison was a career military man in his early 40s, with steel-gray hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent under the harsh desert sun. He had earned a reputation as a fair but firm leader, respected by both his men and the civilian population he was charged with protecting. Samuel had dealt with him numerous times over the years, and while they maintained a cordial relationship, there was always an underlying tension between the military's objectives and the practical needs of ranchers trying to make a living in hostile territory. The column of soldiers rode into the yard, their horses snorting and stamping as they came to a halt near the porch. Samuel noticed immediately that they were escorting someone, a small figure on foot whose hands appeared to be bound. As the dust settled, he could see more clearly. It was a young Apache girl, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, her long black hair hanging loose around her shoulders and her traditional clothing torn and dirty. Captain Morrison dismounted and approached the porch, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. "Morning, Samuel," he said, his voice carrying the formal tone he typically used when conducting official business. "I hope you and your family are well." Samuel nodded, though his attention remained focused on the girl. Even from a distance, he could see the defiance in her posture, the way she held her head high despite her obvious captivity. There was something in her bearing that reminded him of a wild mustang he had once tried to break, a creature that would rather die than submit to human control. "What brings you out this way, Captain?" Samuel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The military had been conducting sweeping operations throughout the region, rounding up Apache families and forcing them onto the San Carlos reservation. Morrison's expression grew somber as he gestured toward the girl. "We found her yesterday, about 20 miles south of here. Her family—" He paused, clearly struggling with how to explain the situation. "There was a skirmish with a group of Apache warriors who had left the reservation. When the fighting ended, we found her hiding in a cave nearby. Her parents and 2 older brothers didn't survive the encounter." Samuel felt a familiar knot form in his stomach. He had seen too much death and violence during his years on the frontier, and the sight of orphaned children never failed to affect him deeply. The girl couldn't be much older than his own daughter, Margaret, yet she had already experienced losses that would have broken many adults. "She won't speak," Morrison continued. "At least not in English. My interpreter says she understands what we're saying, but she refuses to respond. We've been trying to figure out what to do with her. The reservation is overcrowded, and frankly, the conditions there aren't suitable for a child who's already been through such trauma." Samuel studied the girl more carefully. Despite her obvious exhaustion and grief, there was an unmistakable intelligence in her dark eyes. She was watching the conversation between the men with keen attention, clearly understanding far more than she was willing to reveal. Her clothes, while damaged, showed signs of skilled craftsmanship, intricate beadwork, and designs that spoke of a culture with deep traditions and sophisticated artistic abilities. "What are you asking of me, Captain?" Samuel said, though he was beginning to understand where this conversation was heading. Morrison shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to propose. "I know this is highly irregular, Samuel, but I was hoping you might consider taking her in, at least temporarily. You have children of your own, and this ranch could provide her with stability and safety while we figure out a more permanent solution. The military would compensate you for her care, of course." Samuel's mind raced as he considered the implications of such an arrangement. Taking in an Apache child would be controversial at best, dangerous at worst. Many of his neighbors viewed all Apaches as savage enemies, and harboring one could result in social ostracism or even violence. The girl herself was clearly traumatized and might not welcome such an arrangement, regardless of his intentions. At the same time, Samuel couldn't ignore the voice in his conscience that urged him to help. He had always prided himself on being a man of principle, someone who tried to do what was right, even when it wasn't easy or convenient. His late wife Martha had possessed an especially strong sense of compassion for those in need, and he could almost hear her voice urging him to offer assistance to this orphaned child. "Let me talk to her," Samuel said finally. Morrison looked surprised but nodded his agreement. "I should warn you, she's been quite hostile toward anyone who approaches her. 2 of my men have bite marks to prove it." Samuel stepped down from the porch and walked slowly toward the girl, making sure to keep his movements deliberate and non-threatening. As he drew closer, he could see the tension in her body, the way she prepared to fight or flee despite her bound hand. Her eyes followed his every movement, calculating and wary. When he was about 10 feet away, Samuel stopped and crouched down, bringing himself closer to her eye level. He had learned from years of working with frightened animals that sometimes the best approach was simply to wait, to let the other party make the first move. "My name is Samuel," he said quietly, speaking in English, but using a gentle tone that he hoped would convey his peaceful intentions. "I'm sorry about what happened to your family." The girl's expression didn't change, but Samuel thought he detected a slight softening around her eyes. She continued to stare at him with intense concentration, as if trying to read his thoughts and determine whether he represented another threat or a potential source of safety. Samuel remained motionless for several minutes, letting the girl study him while he observed her in return. Despite her youth and obvious vulnerability, there was a strength in her demeanor that impressed him. She had survived a traumatic loss and found herself surrounded by strangers who spoke a different language and followed customs that must seem alien to her, yet she maintained her dignity and composure. "I have 3 children," Samuel continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "They lost their mother 2 years ago. I know what it's like to lose someone you love." For the first time since his arrival, something flickered in the girl's expression. It was subtle, but Samuel caught a momentary crack in her defenses, a glimpse of the profound grief that lay beneath her stoic exterior. Slowly, Samuel reached into his pocket and withdrew a piece of hardtack, a simple biscuit that he had grabbed from the kitchen before coming outside. He held it out toward the girl, not moving any closer, but making the offering available. The girl stared at the food for a long moment, clearly torn between hunger and suspicion. Eventually, practical need won out over caution. She stepped forward just far enough to snatch the biscuit from his outstretched hand, then quickly retreated to her original position. As she ate, Samuel noticed how carefully she chewed each bite, making the small portion last as long as possible. When had she last had a proper meal? How long had she been surviving on whatever scraps she could find in the wilderness? "Captain," Samuel called over his shoulder, "untie her hands." Morrison stepped forward, his expression concerned. "Samuel, I don't think that's wise. She's already tried to escape twice, and like I said, she's bitten 2 of my men." Samuel turned to face the officer, his jaw set with determination. "If I'm going to take responsibility for her, then she's not going to be treated like a prisoner on my ranch. Either untie her hands or find someone else to take her." The captain hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he signaled to one of his sergeants, who approached the girl cautiously and cut the ropes binding her wrists. The girl immediately began rubbing her hands, trying to restore circulation to her fingers. Samuel watched as she tested her newfound freedom, flexing her hands and rotating her shoulders. He half expected her to bolt for the open desert, but instead she remained where she was, continuing to watch him with those penetrating dark eyes. "What's your name?" Samuel asked gently. The girl said nothing, but Samuel thought he saw her lips move slightly, as if she were about to speak, but then decided against it. Behind them, the front door of the ranch house opened with its characteristic creak. Samuel turned to see his 3 children emerging onto the porch, drawn by the commotion in the yard. Thomas, tall for his 14 years, but still carrying the awkward proportions of adolescence, stood with his arms crossed, his expression skeptical and guarded. Margaret, her long brown hair neatly braided and her dress carefully pressed despite the early hour, looked curious but wary. Little William, pale and thin, clutched a small wooden horse that Samuel had carved for him the previous Christmas. The Apache girl's attention shifted immediately to the children, and Samuel saw something change in her demeanor. The fierce wariness remained, but it was tempered now by what might have been recognition or even sympathy. Perhaps she saw in their faces something that reminded her of her own lost siblings. Margaret, ever the caretaker, was the first to speak. "Papa, who is she?" Samuel chose his words carefully, aware that his children's reaction would likely influence his final decision about whether to take the girl in. "Her name is..." He paused, realizing he still didn't know what to call her. "She's lost her family, and Captain Morrison was wondering if we might help her for a while." Thomas's expression hardened. "She's Apache, isn't she? Like the ones who've been raiding the settlements?" "Thomas," Samuel said firmly, "she's a child who has lost everything, just like you lost your mother. That's all that matters right now." The rebuke stung, and Samuel immediately regretted his harsh tone. Thomas had been struggling with anger and resentment since Martha's death, and comparing his grief to that of an Apache girl was unlikely to generate sympathy. Margaret, however, stepped forward with the kind of natural compassion that reminded Samuel so much of his late wife. "She looks hungry, Papa, and her clothes are torn. Does she have somewhere to sleep?" The Apache girl's eyes fixed on Margaret with intense interest. Here was someone closer to her own age, someone who seemed to understand the importance of basic human needs like food and shelter. Little William, who had been hiding behind his siblings, suddenly broke free and walked to the edge of the porch. He didn't speak, but he held out the wooden horse toward the girl, offering to share one of his most precious possessions. The gesture was so unexpected and innocent that it seemed to affect everyone present, including the normally stoic soldiers. The Apache girl stared at the carved toy for a long moment, then looked up at William's face. Something passed between them, a moment of understanding that transcended language and cultural differences. Samuel made his decision. "Captain Morrison, I'll take her in." The officer looked relieved but also concerned. "Are you certain, Samuel? This isn't a decision you should make lightly. Taking in an Apache child will bring attention from the territorial government, and not all of it will be friendly." Samuel nodded, fully aware of the risks he was accepting. "I understand the complications, Captain, but that girl has been through enough trauma. She deserves a chance to heal, and maybe we can all learn something from each other." Morrison spent another hour at the ranch, discussing practical matters and official paperwork. The girl would be placed in Samuel's custody temporarily, with the understanding that a more permanent solution would need to be found eventually. The military would provide a small monthly payment to help cover her expenses, though Samuel suspected it would be far less than the actual cost of raising a child. As the soldiers prepared to leave, Captain Morrison pulled Samuel aside for a private conversation. "I want you to understand what you're getting into," he said quietly. "That girl comes from a proud warrior culture. Her people have been fighting for their survival and their way of life for generations. She's not going to simply accept this situation and become a docile member of your household." Samuel glanced toward the girl, who was now sitting on the ground near the porch, still watching William with curious eyes. "I wouldn't expect her to. If she's going to stay here, it needs to be because she chooses to, not because she's forced to." After the soldiers departed, an uncomfortable silence settled over the ranch. Samuel's children retreated to the house, unsure how to react to the presence of their unexpected guest. The Apache girl remained in the yard, seemingly uncertain about what was expected of her. Samuel approached her slowly, once again making sure his movements were non-threatening. "You're welcome to come inside," he said. "There's food, and we can find you some clean clothes." The girl looked toward the house, then back at Samuel. For a moment, he thought she might accept his invitation, but instead she walked toward the large oak tree behind the house, the same tree where Martha was buried. She settled herself beneath its branches, leaning back against the trunk. Samuel realized she was making a statement. She would stay on his land, but on her own terms. She would not be forced into his house or his way of life until she was ready to make that choice herself. As the day wore on, Samuel went about his normal routine of ranch work, but he found himself constantly aware of the girl's presence. She remained beneath the oak tree, occasionally accepting water or food when Margaret brought it to her, but otherwise keeping to herself. Several times, Samuel noticed William sitting on the back porch, staring in the girl's direction with obvious fascination. The boy had shown more interest and engagement in the past few hours than he had in months, and Samuel began to wonder if the girl's presence might somehow help his son find his way back from the silent world he had inhabited since his mother's death. As evening approached and the desert began to cool, Samuel made a decision that would set the tone for everything that followed. Instead of trying to convince the girl to come inside, he gathered some blankets and a pillow from the house and brought them to her beneath the tree. "It gets cold at night," he said simply, setting the bedding beside her. The girl looked up at him with an expression that might have been surprise. Perhaps she had expected him to force her compliance, to insist that she conform to his household's routines and expectations. Samuel walked back toward the house but paused at the back porch. "My wife is buried here," he said, gesturing toward the small headstone near the tree. "Her name was Martha. She would have wanted you to feel safe here." The girl said nothing, but Samuel saw her glance toward the grave marker with what looked like understanding. Maybe she recognized something universal in grief, something that transcended the barriers between their two cultures. That night, as Samuel lay in his bed listening to the sounds of the desert, he found himself thinking about the day's events and wondering what he had set in motion. Taking in the Apache girl was either an act of compassion that would benefit everyone involved, or a terrible mistake that would bring danger to his family. Through his bedroom window, he could see the oak tree in the moonlight and the small figure huddled beneath it. The girl had accepted his blankets but remained alert, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. Samuel realized that earning her trust would be a long and difficult process, requiring patience and understanding that he wasn't sure he possessed. In the distance, a coyote howled, its lonely voice echoing across the desert. Samuel heard the girl shift position beneath the tree, and he wondered if the sound reminded her of her lost family and the life she had known before tragedy struck. The next morning brought new challenges and small revelations. Samuel woke before dawn, as was his custom, and looked out to check on his unexpected guest. The girl was no longer beneath the tree, and for a moment his heart sank, thinking she had fled during the night. Then he spotted her near the horse corral, standing motionless as she observed the animals. His finest stallion, a temperamental black Mustang named Thunder, that usually shied away from strangers, was approaching the fence where she stood. Samuel watched in amazement as the normally skittish horse allowed the girl to touch his muzzle, responding to her presence with unusual calm. Samuel dressed quickly and stepped outside, careful not to make any sudden movements that might startle either the girl or the horse. As he drew closer, he could hear her speaking in a language he didn't recognize, presumably Apache. Her voice was soft and melodious, and Thunder seemed to be listening to every word. "He doesn't usually take to strangers," Samuel said quietly. The girl turned to look at him, and for the first time since her arrival, Samuel saw something other than wariness in her expression. There was a spark of pride, perhaps even satisfaction, as if she were pleased to demonstrate a skill that impressed him. "You have a way with animals," Samuel continued, moving closer to the fence. "That's a valuable gift." The girl returned her attention to Thunder, running her hand along the horse's neck with confident, practiced movements. Samuel realized that she had probably grown up around horses, that riding and animal husbandry were likely as natural to her as breathing. Margaret appeared on the back porch, carrying a plate of breakfast. She approached the corral hesitantly, clearly unsure how to interact with their guest. "I brought you some food," she said, offering the plate to the Apache girl. The girl accepted the food with a slight nod, the closest thing to a thank you that she had offered since her arrival. As she ate, Samuel noticed that she ate quickly but without desperation, suggesting that she had learned to be cautious about when and where she consumed food. Thomas emerged from the barn, leading 2 horses that he had saddled for the day's work. He paused when he saw the group gathered around the corral, his expression troubled. Samuel could read his son's thoughts easily enough. The presence of the Apache girl was disrupting the familiar routines and relationships that had helped the family maintain stability after Martha's death. "We need to check the north pasture today," Thomas said to his father, pointedly ignoring the girl. Jenkins mentioned seeing some stray cattle heading toward the canyon. Samuel nodded, understanding that his son was trying to restore normalcy by focusing on ranch business. "Get the gear ready. I'll be along shortly." As Thomas led the horses away, Samuel turned back to the girl. She had finished eating and was once again stroking Thunder's neck, but he could see that she had been watching the interaction between father and son with keen interest. "That's my oldest boy, Thomas," Samuel explained. "He's been taking on a lot of responsibility since his mother died. It's been hard on him." The girl looked toward the barn where Thomas had disappeared, then back at Samuel. He thought he saw a flicker of understanding in her expression, as if she recognized the burden of premature responsibility. Little William appeared at the back door, still clutching his wooden horse. He had clearly been watching from inside the house, working up the courage to venture outside. The girl noticed him immediately, and Samuel was surprised to see her expression soften. William walked slowly toward the corral, stopping about 10 feet away. He held out the wooden horse again, just as he had done the previous day. This time, however, the girl responded differently. She moved away from the fence and crouched down, bringing herself closer to the boy's eye level. William took a few tentative steps forward, then placed the wooden horse on the ground between them. The girl reached out and picked up the toy, examining it carefully. Samuel held his breath, wondering how she would respond to this gesture of friendship from his youngest child. The girl turned the horse over in her hands, running her fingers along the grain of the wood and tracing the simple but skillful carving. Then she began to speak, her voice so quiet that Samuel had to strain to hear her words. She was speaking in Apache, but her tone was gentle and approving, almost as if she were praising the craftsmanship of the toy. William couldn't understand the words, but he seemed to recognize the kindness in her voice. For the first time in months, Samuel saw his son smile. The girl handed the wooden horse back to William, but instead of retreating, she remained crouched near him. She pointed to herself and said something in her own language, then repeated it more slowly. William tilted his head, trying to understand. The girl tried again, this time pointing to herself and saying what sounded like Ayana. She repeated the word several times, emphasizing each syllable. Samuel realized that she was telling them her name. After nearly 2 days of silence, she was finally beginning to reveal something about herself. Ayana, William repeated carefully, his small voice clear in the morning air. The girl smiled, the first genuine expression of happiness that Samuel had seen from her. She nodded encouragingly and repeated her name again, this time directing it towards Samuel and Margaret. Ayana, Samuel said, testing the unfamiliar sounds. That's a beautiful name. Margaret stepped forward, emboldened by the girl's apparent willingness to communicate. I'm Margaret, she said, pointing to herself. And that's my papa, Samuel. Ayana listened carefully as Margaret introduced the family members, nodding as if filing away each name for future reference. When Margaret pointed toward the barn where Thomas had gone, Ayana's expression grew more thoughtful, as if she understood that the oldest child was struggling with her presence. The breakthrough with Ayana's name seemed to open a door that had been firmly closed since her arrival. Over the following days, she began to respond more readily to attempts at communication, though she still spoke very little English. Samuel found himself learning a few words of Apache from her, simple terms for things like water, food, and horses. More importantly, Ayana began to show interest in the daily activities of ranch life. She watched Samuel and Thomas as they worked with the cattle, observed Margaret as she tended the vegetable garden behind the house, and seemed particularly fascinated by the various tasks required to maintain their isolated homestead. Samuel noticed that she was especially drawn to anything involving horses. She spent hours near the corral, and the animals responded to her presence with remarkable calmness. Even the most stubborn and temperamental horses seemed to trust her instinctively, allowing her to approach and handle them in ways that impressed even Thomas, who had grown up around the animals. One afternoon, while Samuel was repairing a section of fence damaged by a recent storm, he saw Ayana slip through the rails of the corral and approach Thunder. The stallion, who barely tolerated anyone except Samuel himself, stood perfectly still as she examined his hooves and legs with the practiced eye of someone who understood horses. Samuel set down his tools and moved closer, curious about what she was doing. Ayana seemed to be checking Thunder for injuries or problems, running her hands along his legs and peering closely at his hooves. When she found what she was looking for, she called out to Samuel in a mixture of Apache and the few English words she had learned. Following her gestures and pointing, Samuel realized that she had discovered a small stone lodged in Thunder's front hoof, something that could have caused lameness if left untreated. The stone was wedged so tightly and positioned so awkwardly that Samuel himself might have missed it during his regular examinations. Working together, with Ayana holding Thunder steady while Samuel removed the stone, they prevented what could have been a serious problem for the valuable stallion. As they finished the task, Samuel looked at the girl with new respect. "Where did you learn so much about horses?" he asked. Ayana considered the question for a moment, then pointed toward the distant mountains where the Apache territories lay. She spoke several sentences in her own language, her voice taking on a wistful quality that suggested she was remembering happier times. Although Samuel couldn't understand her words, he could hear the longing in her voice, the deep connection she felt to a way of life that had been torn away from her. He realized that her knowledge of horses wasn't just practical skill, but a link to her cultural identity and the family she had lost. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Samuel made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of eating in the dining room, as was their custom, he suggested they have their meal on the back porch, where Ayana could join them without feeling pressured to enter the house. Margaret quickly set an extra place at the small table they used for outdoor meals during the summer, while Thomas carried out chairs for everyone. Ayana watched these preparations with obvious uncertainty, unsure whether she was truly welcome or if this was some kind of test. Samuel solved her dilemma by sitting down at the table and gesturing for her to join them. "We're a family here," he said simply, "and family eats together." Ayana approached the table slowly, taking the seat that Margaret indicated. As they began to eat, Samuel noticed that she was careful to follow their example, watching how they used their utensils and trying to match their table manners. It was clear that she wanted to show respect for their customs, even as she maintained her own cultural identity. William, emboldened by Ayana's presence at the family table, began to speak for the first time in months. His words came slowly and hesitantly, but he managed to tell a simple story about something he had seen in the barn that day. Ayana listened attentively, nodding and smiling at appropriate moments, even though she probably understood only a fraction of what he was saying. Samuel felt tears prick his eyes as he watched his youngest son slowly emerging from the shell of silence that had surrounded him since Martha's death. Whatever challenges lay ahead, it was clear that Ayana's presence was already having a positive impact on his family. As the sun set over the desert and the family finished their meal together, Samuel reflected on the unexpected turn his life had taken. 3 days ago, he had been a widowed rancher, struggling to raise 3 grieving children in an unforgiving landscape. Now he found himself the guardian of an Apache girl, whose presence was somehow helping to heal wounds that had seemed permanent. But Samuel also knew that they were still in the early stages of a complex and potentially dangerous situation. Ayana was beginning to trust them, but she remained deeply traumatized by her losses. His own children were still adjusting to her presence, and Thomas in particular seemed uncomfortable with the arrangement. More concerning were the potential external threats. News of his decision to take in an Apache child would spread quickly through the territorial community, and not everyone would approve. There were people who would see Ayana as a threat, regardless of her age or circumstances. Samuel had to be prepared to defend his decision and protect his family from those who might view their compassion as betrayal. As the family prepared to retire for the evening, Ayana gathered her blankets and started toward the oak tree where she had been sleeping. But William surprised everyone by running after her, tugging on her sleeve and pointing toward the house. The little boy spoke rapidly, his words tumbling over each other in his excitement. He wanted Ayana to come inside, to see his room and the wooden animals that Samuel had carved for him over the years. Margaret joined her brother's plea, assuring Ayana that she would be safe and comfortable in the house. Ayana looked toward Samuel, seeking permission or perhaps reassurance. He nodded encouragingly, understanding that this was an important moment. If she was willing to enter their home, it would represent a significant step in her journey toward healing and acceptance. Slowly, hesitantly, Ayana allowed William to lead her toward the back door. Samuel watched as his children escorted their Apache sister into the house and he realized that his family was about to face its greatest test yet. The real challenges were just beginning, and Samuel had no way of knowing whether the fragile trust they had built over the past few days would be strong enough to survive what lay ahead. But as he followed his children into the house, he felt a spark of hope that had been missing from his life since Martha's death. Perhaps Ayanna had come to them for a reason. Perhaps she was meant to teach them something about survival, resilience, and the possibility of finding family in the most unexpected places. Or perhaps they were meant to teach her that not all white settlers saw her as an enemy, that there were people willing to bridge the gap between their two worlds. Only time would tell whether their unlikely family could overcome the obstacles that awaited them, but Samuel was determined to give them all the chance they deserved. Chapter 2. Bonds Forged in Trust. 3 weeks had passed since Ayanna first entered the Harrison house, and the rhythm of ranch life had slowly adjusted to accommodate their newest family member. The Apache girl had claimed the small room at the end of the hallway, originally intended as storage space, but quickly converted with a proper bed, washstand, and window that looked out toward the mountains where her people lived. Samuel watched from the kitchen window as Ayanna worked with Thunder in the corral, her movements fluid and confident as she guided the powerful stallion through exercises that would have challenged experienced horsemen. She had an intuitive understanding of the animals that went far beyond simple training techniques, seeming to communicate with them through subtle body language and gentle vocal cues that calmed even the most spirited horses. Margaret had become Ayanna's closest companion among the Harrison children, and the two girls spent hours together working in the garden, sharing household chores, and attempting to teach each other their respective languages. Margaret's patient nature and natural empathy had helped bridge the gap between their different worlds, and Samuel often heard them laughing together as they discovered ways to communicate despite the language barrier. William had made perhaps the most remarkable progress of all. The silent, withdrawn boy, who had barely spoken since his mother's death, had begun to find his voice again, inspired by Ayanna's patient attention and genuine interest in his thoughts and feelings. She listened to his halting words with the same intensity she brought to working with horses, and her encouragement had given him the confidence to gradually rejoin family conversations. Thomas remained the holdout, his skepticism about Ayanna's presence unchanged, despite the positive changes she had brought to the household. The 14-year-old struggled with conflicting emotions, appreciating how she had helped his younger siblings while resenting the disruption to their established routines. He treated her with distant politeness, but avoided spending time alone with her, maintaining an invisible barrier that Samuel hoped would eventually dissolve. The morning of the 22nd day brought unexpected visitors. Samuel was in the barn checking on a mare who was expected to foal soon when he heard the sound of approaching horses. He stepped outside to see 3 riders coming up the main road to the ranch, their pace deliberate and their bearing official. Samuel recognized the lead rider immediately, Judge Harrison Blackwood, the territorial magistrate whose jurisdiction included their area of Arizona. Blackwood was a man in his late 50s, with graying hair and the kind of stern demeanor that came from years of making difficult legal decisions on the frontier. He was accompanied by 2 other men Samuel didn't recognize, though their clothing and bearing suggested they were government officials of some kind. The judge dismounted near the porch and approached Samuel with the formal courtesy that marked all their interactions. "Good morning, Samuel. I trust you and your family are well." Samuel nodded, though he felt a familiar knot of tension forming in his stomach. Judge Blackwood's visits were rarely social calls, and the presence of the additional officials suggested this was serious business. "Judge Blackwood, gentlemen, what brings you out this way?" Blackwood's expression remained carefully neutral. "I believe you know why we're here, Samuel. Word has reached the territorial capital about your arrangement with the Apache girl. There are concerns that need to be addressed." The shorter of the 2 accompanying men stepped forward, removing a leather portfolio from his saddlebag. "I'm William Hendricks, from the Bureau of Indian Affairs," he said crisply. "This is Marcus Reed from the Territorial Attorney General's office. We're here to discuss the legal status of the Apache child currently residing on your property." Samuel had been dreading this moment since the day he agreed to take Ayana in. He knew that their arrangement was temporary and legally questionable, but he had hoped for more time to find a permanent solution that would serve her best interests. "The girl's name is Ayana," Samuel said firmly, "and she's not residing on my property. She's living with my family because she has nowhere else to go." Hendricks consulted his papers with bureaucratic efficiency. "According to our records, all Apache individuals in this territory are supposed to be relocated to the San Carlos Reservation. There are no exceptions for minors, especially those whose families were involved in hostile actions against government forces." "Her family wasn't involved in hostile actions," Samuel replied, his voice hardening. "They were trying to survive in their ancestral homeland, and she's a child who witnessed her parents and brothers being killed. She deserves better than being warehoused on a reservation that's already overcrowded and underfunded." Judge Blackwood held up a hand to prevent the discussion from escalating into an argument. "Samuel, I understand your position, and I respect the compassion you've shown. But we're dealing with federal law and territorial policy. The situation is more complicated than personal sentiment." As they spoke, Samuel became aware that Ayana had emerged from the barn and was watching the conversation from a distance. She remained partially hidden behind the corner of the building, but he could see the tension in her posture as she observed the official-looking strangers. Marcus Reed, the Attorney General's representative, spoke for the first time. "There's also the matter of public safety, Mr. Harrison. The Apache tribes have been responsible for numerous attacks on settlers and military units. Harboring one of their members, regardless of age, sends the wrong message to both the Indian population and the civilian communities." Samuel felt anger rising in his chest. "That girl has never harmed anyone. She spent the last 3 weeks helping care for my children and working alongside my family. If you're looking for threats to public safety, you're looking in the wrong place." "Nevertheless," Hendricks interrupted, "she needs to be relocated to the reservation where she can be properly supervised and educated in civilized ways. It's for her own good as well as the good of the territory." Samuel was about to respond when a new voice joined the conversation. "Papa, what's happening?" Margaret had appeared on the porch, followed closely by William and Thomas. All 3 children looked concerned about the presence of the official visitors and the obvious tension in their father's voice. Judge Blackwood's expression softened slightly when he saw the children. "Good morning, Margaret. I hope you're taking good care of your family." Margaret nodded politely, but kept her attention focused on her father. "Papa, they're not here about Ayana, are they?" The question hung in the air for a moment before Samuel answered. "These gentlemen think Ayana would be better off living on the reservation." William stepped forward, his small face set with unusual determination. "But she belongs here with us. She's part of our family now." Hendricks looked at the boy with barely concealed impatience. "Son, you don't understand the larger issues involved. This Apache girl needs to be with her own people, where she can learn proper behavior and contribute to society in appropriate ways." Thomas, who had remained silent during most of Ayana's stay, surprised everyone by speaking up. "What do you mean, her own people? Her people are dead. We're the only family she has left." Samuel felt a surge of pride at his oldest son's words, realizing that Thomas had been more affected by Ayana's presence than he had let on. Despite his outward resistance, the boy had developed protective feelings toward their Apache sister. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Samuel turned to see Ayana riding Thunder at a full gallop across the pasture, her long black hair streaming behind her as she guided the powerful stallion with remarkable skill. She brought the horse to a sliding stop near the group, dismounting with fluid grace. For a moment, everyone stood in silence, awed by the display of horsemanship they had just witnessed. Even the government officials seemed impressed, though they quickly reasserted their professional demeanor. Ayana approached the group slowly, her dark eyes taking in the strangers and the tense atmosphere. She moved to stand beside Samuel, positioning herself as part of the family unit, rather than as an outsider seeking protection. "This is Ayana," Samuel said simply. "She's been living with us for 3 weeks, and she's become an important part of our family." Hendrik studied the girl with obvious skepticism. "Can she speak English?" Ayana looked directly at the official and answered in clear, carefully pronounced words. "I speak English. I understand what you want to do to me." The clarity and intelligence in her response seemed to surprise the visitors. They had probably expected to find a frightened, silent child who would be easily intimidated by official authority. Judge Blackwood leaned forward slightly. "Ayana, these men are here to help you. They think you would be happier living with other Apache people on the reservation." Ayana's expression didn't change, but Samuel could see the steely determination in her eyes that reminded him of her first day on the ranch. "I have seen the reservation. My cousin lives there now. The people are sad and hungry. Children die from sickness because there is not enough medicine or food." Reed stepped forward, his voice taking on a patronizing tone. "You're too young to understand these complex matters. The government is working to improve conditions on the reservations and provide education and opportunities for your people." "My people are here," Ayana said quietly, gesturing towards Samuel and his children. "They took me in when I had nowhere to go. They feed me and keep me safe and treat me like family. Why would I leave them to go to a place where people are dying?" The simple logic of her statement seemed to deflate some of the officials' arguments. Hendricks consulted his papers again, clearly struggling to find a bureaucratic response to such a direct human appeal. Samuel decided to take control of the conversation. "Gentlemen, I understand that you have regulations to follow and policies to enforce. But before you make any final decisions, I think you should know what Ayana has meant to this family." He gestured toward William, who moved closer to Ayana's side. "My youngest son hasn't spoken more than a few words since his mother died 2 years ago. Ayana has helped him find his voice again. She's patient with him, listens to him, and makes him feel valued and understood." Margaret stepped forward as well. "She's teaching me about plants and animals and how to take care of horses. She knows things about healing and medicine that could help people in our community." Thomas, surprising everyone again, added his voice to the chorus. "She's probably the best rider I've ever seen, and she can spot problems with the livestock that the rest of us miss. She's making this ranch better and stronger." Samuel looked directly at Judge Blackwood. "This isn't about harboring an enemy or defying government policy. This is about a child who has found a place where she can heal and grow and contribute. Taking her away from here would be cruel and unnecessary." Hendricks and Reed exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional testimony they were hearing. They had probably expected to find a simple case of misguided charity that could be easily resolved through official channels. Judge Blackwood studied Ayana for a long moment, then looked around at the Harrison family gathered protectively around her. Samuel could see him weighing legal requirements against human compassion, trying to find a solution that would satisfy both his official duties and his personal conscience. "There may be another option," the judge said finally. "The territorial government has been discussing the possibility of allowing qualified families to serve as official guardians for Indian children who have been orphaned or separated from their tribes. It would require formal legal proceedings and regular inspections, but it might provide a framework for this arrangement." Hendricks looked skeptical. "Judge, I'm not sure that program has been officially approved yet. And even if it has, there would be strict requirements for the guardian families." "What kind of requirements?" Samuel asked. Reed consulted his own set of papers. "The guardian family would need to demonstrate financial stability, moral character, and the ability to provide proper education and religious instruction. The child would need to show progress in learning English and adapting to civilized customs. There would be quarterly inspections and annual reviews. Samuel felt a flicker of hope. The requirements sounded manageable, and formal guardianship would provide legal protection for Ayana while allowing her to remain with the family. "We can meet those requirements," he said confidently. "Ayana is already learning English and adapting to our way of life, but she's also maintaining her own cultural identity. We're not trying to erase who she is." Judge Blackwood nodded thoughtfully. "I think we can work something out. I'll need to send some telegrams and review the current regulations, but there's precedent for this kind of arrangement in other territories." Hendrik still looked unconvinced. "Judge, what about the security concerns? What if this Apache girl maintains contact with hostile elements of her tribe?" Ayana spoke before anyone else could answer. "My tribe is scattered. Some are on the reservation, some are hiding in the mountains, some are dead. I do not know where the others are, and they do not know where I am. I'm not a threat to anyone." The simple honesty in her words seemed to resonate with Judge Blackwood. "I think we can address the security concerns through the regular inspection process. If there's any indication of problematic contact or behavior, the arrangement can be terminated." Reed and Hendrik spent another hour discussing technicalities and procedures, but the basic framework had been established. Samuel would apply for formal guardianship of Ayana through the territorial court system, with Judge Blackwood overseeing the process. If approved, the arrangement would be subject to regular review, but would provide legal protection for their family situation. As the officials prepared to leave, Judge Blackwood pulled Samuel aside for a private conversation. "I want you to understand that this won't be easy. There are people in the territorial government and in the surrounding communities who won't approve of what you're doing. You'll face criticism and possibly even threats." Samuel nodded, fully aware of the challenges that lay ahead. "Judge, I've thought about this from every angle. Taking Ayana in was the right thing to do, and I'm not going to abandon her now just because it's politically complicated. I admire your conviction, Samuel. I hope it doesn't cause you more trouble than you can handle." After the officials departed, the Harrison family gathered on the back porch to discuss what had happened. Ayana sat quietly while Samuel explained the guardianship process and what it would mean for their family. "Does this mean Ayana can stay with us permanently?" Margaret asked. Samuel chose his words carefully. "It means we're going to try to make that happen. There are legal procedures to follow and requirements to meet, but if everything goes well, Ayana could become an official member of our family." William clapped his hands together with excitement. "That would make her our real sister." Thomas, who had been unusually supportive during the officials' visit, looked thoughtful. "What if they decide we're not good enough guardians? What happens to Ayana then?" The question hung in the air, highlighting the uncertainty that still surrounded their situation. Samuel realized that they were embarking on a legal and social experiment with no guarantee of success. "Then we'll figure out another way," he said finally. "We're not going to let anyone take Ayana away from us if we can help it." Ayana, who had been listening to the conversation with typical intensity, spoke for the first time since the officials had left. "Why are you willing to fight for me? You could have let them take me to the reservation and avoided all this trouble." Samuel looked at the girl who had become so important to his family in such a short time. "Because you belong here, Ayana. You've helped us heal and grow in ways we didn't think were possible. We're not the same family we were before you came, and we don't want to go back to the way things were." Margaret reached over and took Ayana's hand. "You're our sister now. That's what families do for each other." Thomas nodded in agreement, and even William added his voice to the chorus of support. For the first time since the official's visit, Ayana smiled, the expression transforming her face and reminding Samuel of how young she really was, despite all the hardships she had endured. That evening, as the family prepared for bed, Samuel found himself thinking about the journey they had all taken together. 3 weeks ago, they had been strangers thrown together by tragic circumstances and military necessity. Now they were a family bound together by choice, love, and mutual support. The legal challenges ahead would be difficult, and there were no guarantees that their unconventional arrangement would survive the scrutiny of territorial bureaucracy. But Samuel felt confident that they had built something worth fighting for, a bond that transcended cultural differences and social expectations. As he made his final rounds of the ranch, checking on the animals and securing the buildings for the night, Samuel paused outside Ayana's window. Inside, he could see her sitting on her bed, carefully mending one of William's shirts that had been torn during the day's play. The simple domestic scene filled him with warmth and determination. Whatever challenges lay ahead, the Harrison family would face them together. They had already proven that love and compassion could bridge even the most difficult divides, and Samuel believed that their example might help others understand that the path to peace lay not in separation and suspicion, but in opening their hearts to unexpected possibilities. 3 months later, Judge Blackwood returned to the vHe ranch with a leather portfolio containing official documents. Samuel gathered his family on the front porch as the judge explained that the territorial government had approved their application for guardianship. Ayana Harrison, as she would now be legally known, had become an official member of the family with all the rights and protections that status provided. The quarterly inspections would continue for 2 years, but the judge expressed confidence that the arrangement would become permanent. As Samuel signed the final papers, he reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment. The Apache girl who had arrived as a traumatized orphan had become the catalyst for his family's healing and growth. She had taught them that love could transcend cultural boundaries, that families could be formed by choice as well as blood, and that sometimes the greatest gifts came from the most unexpected sources. William, now chattering constantly and full of life, ran to show Ayana the wooden animals Samuel had carved for her as a celebration gift. Margaret began making plans for a special dinner to mark the occasion. Even Thomas, who had become one of Ayana's strongest protectors, smiled as he watched his siblings' excitement. Samuel realized that Martha would have been proud of the family they had become. They had honored her memory by opening their hearts to someone in need, and in doing so, they had discovered that healing was possible even after the deepest losses. As the sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, the Harrison family stood together on their porch, complete at last. They had learned that sometimes the strongest bonds were forged not by blood or tradition, but by the simple decision to care for one another, regardless of the obstacles. Ayana had taught them how to live again, and in return, they had given her a home, a family, and a future filled with possibilities. It was a lesson that would resonate through generations, a testament to the power of compassion to transform lives and build bridges across even the deepest divides. The Apache girl, labeled savage by those who didn't know her, had instead proven to be a teacher, a healer, and ultimately the missing piece that made the Harrison family whole again. And in the vast expanse of the Arizona territory, where survival often depended on strength and stubbornness, they had discovered that sometimes the greatest strength lay in the willingness to love.